Hello everyone. In the so-called data decade, data is expected to grow by 175 billion zettabytes until the year 2025. Data and artificial intelligence are therefore critical to any digital transformation. My name is Sudhish Mohan. I'm the Chief Digital and Customer Success Officer at Microsoft South Africa. Today with me, I have a panel of experts who will assist us through answering some of the questions that have been posed in the industry that will be relevant to you. Let me first introduce you to the first panel member, Paul.
Morning, Sudhish. Thank you very much for having us. Yes, Paul Morley from Nedbank. Been looking after our data ecosphere and enterprise for about 11 years. Been in the industry for almost 30. Been at Nedbank for 20. And very excited to be here today and be involved in a very exciting time to be involved in data going forward. So that's me.
Thank you, Paul. We look forward to your insights. Adrian?
Yes, thanks, Sudhish. So I'm Adrian Denoon. I'm from Hollard Insurance, and I head up architecture in the short-term leg of the group. Been with Hollard also for, like Paul, very many years, well over 25 years now, and yeah, looking forward to doing answer some of these questions that you've got here.
Excellent. So I gave a worldwide view of what is happening with data. And I'm sure all of you have seen that over the past year with the COVID pandemic, how digital transformation has accelerated in many industries. From a local market perspective, we are seeing year-on-year growth of approximately 42% of data and artificial intelligence growth in the South African market. So let me start with you, Paul. First question that I have is, I guess every organization is going through a cultural shift. Can you tell me some of the things that you are seeing in your organization around a data culture, and how are you driving and influencing that amongst the management team?
So the first thing I'd like to kick off with, I always have this thing around data culture. Culture is culture. There isn't a data culture, a Nedbank culture, a finance or a culture. Culture is a culture, and I think that's sort of the first way we need to approach when you inculcate culture. And what we have done is we've tried to not isolate by calling it data culture, because as soon as you call it a data culture, then it's a thing. Then it's separated from the organization's culture. That's how people perceive it. So one of the first things we did is we mustn't alienate the organization's culture. So for us, data culture is actually inherently part of the culture of the organization. It's not something different. How do we influence this? Data, any culture, it's a repetitive process. To change a culture and behavior of an organization, it's the only way you can influence it or change it is by repetition. Change it and speak about it all the time. Inculcate it as part of your daily conversation. Inculcate it as part of your day-to-day business, as an action, because it's the people that build the culture. It's not the technology or the process. And as we're going through this very accelerated, time we find ourselves in COVID-19, it's obviously been accelerated. So this data conversation becomes more and more important. And this digital conversation becomes more important. It's about repetition. And what we do as part of our team is make sure that the interaction at all levels of the organization is having a data conversation. And through that awareness of having a data conversation, it slowly becomes part of the culture and the backbone of the organization. So it's a long journey, and it's around repetition, it's around practice, it's around communication, it's around continually driving the message home, getting the people to become data literate, understanding what data is. So it's about communication, it's about engagement at all levels. So it's at steering committee levels, it's at board levels, it is at the functional team levels, it's at the individual levels. There is always a data conversation in every conversation we have. There's an element of a data, and that in itself will drive the cultural change required for us to support data. But certainly, I think the lesson learned here is data culture is not something different. It's not a thing, and I think sometimes we in the industry we like to call it data culture, but the moment you do that, it becomes a silo in itself. Now we have this debate around a data culture and an organizational culture. Well, you don't allow the organization to adopt that sort of approach. It must be part of your culture. So for me, the top pieces and learnings from our organization is repeat it, discuss it, repeat it, discuss it, repeat it, discuss it as many times and in many forms as possible. And two, don't call it a data culture. Call it anything but that, because you don't want to isolate it as a thing by itself. So those are some of the big lessons we've learned, and that's the only way to drive us.
Great points, Paul. I think what you're saying is integrate it into your culture, into your way of work. Yes. Make sure it's driven from the top down, bottom up, and across the organization. It's fantastic. Thank you very much, Paul. Adrian, let me move over to you and ask a very different question, right? How do you measure, everyone talks digital transformation, right? Everyone's looking at new sources of data, new business models. How have you gone about monetizing data in your business?
Oh, okay, right. So I think it's, especially in our industry, in the insurance industry, it's probably one of those areas that less likely to monetize data off the bat from the perspective of kind of using it to almost as an asset to sell to other parties. But I think how I would probably answer that is that we've got an awareness that the data that we collect around our policyholders and from our brokers is incredibly important to decision making. And in two parts. Number one is just to be able to price our products correctly and to find out what we need to actually put out to market. That comes into the factor. But then over and above that, I think it's also incredibly important to have the right data to be able to automate processes and reduce the amount of sort of staff looking at sort of menial tasks and let them rather work in the role of a knowledge worker, as an example. So we've been trying to put a lot of emphasis around how can we use data more effectively and start to reduce the cost of overhead of operations. So it's almost an inverse of monetization, I suppose, but it still allows us to reduce costs within an organization by making proper use of our data.
Great, thank you. Paul, how has cloud adoption and maturity in the cloud, in your cloud journey, assisted you to become better with data and AI? And what learnings can you share with us? Were there any particular use cases? Embedding new technology and driving new ways of work, as we're speaking about culture, it's not an easy thing. How have you gone about doing that in the NetBank scenario?
Yeah, so, and again, I think this COVID-19 has accelerated a lot of transformational ideas that organizations had. And one of them in NetBank is our NetBank imperative around cloud first. So from our data community, our data ecosphere enterprise, our data organization, all of our stuff is deployed with a cloud imperative first approach. And I must admit, it's been a challenge. So the learnings for us have been great in terms of how do we approach the cloud, what's good for the organization. And there's a lot of things that you start this journey around digital and cloud without knowing all the impacts to the organization. And when you're dealing with three of the most disruptive strategies that you can in modern age, which is data, digital, and cloud, people often forget that those strategies actually fundamentally change the bricks and mortar of the organization, or they have the potential of changing the bricks and mortar of an organization. So it has a physical effect on the organization. It's not just a logical change. It's not just a logical approach. So again, around the cloud is going with a blank mindset. This is, I call it in the organization the great data reset. So everyone is now equal when they start this journey. You don't have the skills, you don't have the processes, you don't understand. It's a new architecture, it's a new ways of work. You're inculcating execution methodologies like agile and safe and all those things. So everybody is now being seen as an equal. There isn't any experts anymore. And it doesn't matter if you are an expert or not an expert. Everybody is now equal, from the 24-year-old to the 50-year-old who's been in the organization 30 years. Everybody has to learn a new set of skills. So I call that the great reset. So and that was a great opportunity to that concept, and the effect of that concept was a great opportunity to sweep the stuff from underneath the carpet and really start again. So it has a fundamental effect, not just about moving the organization and the data technologies into the cloud, but in itself had an effect of all the things that were not necessarily related to cloud and data. You now reset as well. So even stuff that has nothing to do with the cloud, that mindset change, forced the mindset change, forced a different perspective in the world. It had a ripple effect, not just in the specifics that we were moving to the cloud. Now, from a cloud perspective, where we see it, Nedbank has always adopted the approach when it went to its cloud journey with a focus of accelerated engineering and execution. The enhancement of new capability and technologies that we never had before when we dealing with the traditional legacy on-prem organization. So our focus for the cloud, our primary strategic focus, wasn't necessarily normal ways organizations approach the cloud and adopt it. For us, it was about agility. For us, it was about exploring capabilities that could not or have not been employed on-prem. So we're looking for those newer advantages. And that's how we approach the cloud in our value-driven statements. And again, what does that do for you? It has allowed us to explore things periphery to the cloud that we've never been able to do. And that comes back to that mindset, that reset I was talking about. Because it sort of cleared everybody's mind, and we all had a fresh perspective. And we were all seen as equal when it comes to the technology skills and approaches. So the big thing for us is the inconsequential effect, the unintended consequences, put it that way, had a very, very positive effect on Nedbank as a whole. It wasn't just about the topic of cloud anymore. And we adopting those inconsequential effects with open arms, and it's made a big difference in the organization, just around, and again, nothing to do with the cloud necessarily, nothing in that space. Some of the use cases we've got, I mean, from an AI perspective, and again, this is as we go through this process of the cloud. You in our private cloud, just before we started going on to the hybrid and all those, because we're still deep in that transformation process. It had lots of benefits around our fraud and analytics. I mean, some of the stuff hundreds of millions. I won't quote the exact figures, but some of the models we deployed specifically around the fraud analytics around insurance, as an example, massive benefits. And it's in the hundreds of millions, and that was just from a particular use case. So, and again, the other lesson we learned is when it comes to AI and data, you need to look at the world. We're very much used to looking at AI as a use case basis. We deploy it as a use case basis. We talk about it as a use case basis. We want use cases. So everything's about a use case. And the other thing we learned is if you really want to accelerate and enhance the ecosphere, stop talking about use cases. Because use cases, again, is an isolated, you create this impression that you're doing something, but it's over there. You've really got to inculcate that data and AI fundamentally as at the bottom level of your enterprise. Stop calling it use cases, because it is not a use case. It's a fundamental capability of the enterprise. And that's one thing we take a lot of caution in. And we don't necessarily talk around use cases, because that's like a once-off. It implies a once-off thing, in the back of everybody's minds. And we're changing the language. We're changing the language to it must become a capability, inbuilt capability of the enterprise. And when you deliver that function at that level, at the lowest level of the building blocks of your enterprise, then you're going to see value. Because all use cases in itself don't generate value. In fact, the chances of use cases deriving lots of value on a regular basis is quite remote, because a use case has a very, very surgical focus point to the world. It is very narrow in its requirement. It's very narrow in its outcomes, and that's not necessarily AI. Okay, AI must become sort of a fabric that you build the organization on. It's not a surgical thing. It must become an enterprise-wide thing. So that's the other lesson we learned. If you want to accelerate AI across the enterprise, you have to stop looking at it as a use case basis. You have to look at it as a capability that's engineered into the lowest level of your enterprise foundation.
Great, thanks, Paul. And I think I agree with the use case scenario that you just mentioned. I guess the organization, with everyone now being equal in the Great Reset, making sure that everyone is learning, so it's a learning organization capability that you are creating, and building the data and artificial intelligence capability as a core part of doing your work is what you are saying is successful in Nedbank. Great, thank you very much. Adrian, I want to go to a little more of a boring topic for most people. Data governance, right? Boring, but nonetheless essential in the industry in which we operate. I guess two things come to mind. The one component is tell me about how are you dealing with biases in your data, right? That's the one component. And the second component, being in a very regulated industry, how are you dealing with these cloud conversations?
Right, so let me start with the last piece of the question first around the cloud. So, I mean, already many years, well, quite a few years back, we already started looking at moving data to cloud or having to deal with other partners that are cloud-based, either within South Africa or outside in the global community. And more you find in a lot of software as a service type operations being available. And, you know, just as a strategy, our cloud-first strategy, we look at, can we do something in software as a service? Can we do something as a managed service? Which means quite often our data is outside of our sort of bricks and mortar, as was mentioned just now. And we very early on in the stage took a stance that, you know, we'd follow the patterns that kind of align with the European region with regards to data governance, sort of like GDPR rules and things like that. And, you know, we then took a stance that the data would have to be hosted in either sort of EU region or within South Africa. So just from a locale perspective, it kind of limits to whereabout we can keep our data. Over and above that, though, it's really around a lot of due diligence. So, you know, a few years back, we'd look at buying an off-the-shelf product as an example, be looking mostly at features, at potentially, you know, how we're going to host it inside our data center. And that's all kind of changed to, well, you know, where is this product now being hosted? You know, what is their due diligence around the data itself and looking at the protection of data? You know, what do they follow ITIL processes? How do they back up? How do they, you know, deal with DR and such like? So all of that becomes a big change of how we look at investing in platforms versus how we used to. Then with regards to data governance itself, I think there's been a huge shift towards more focus on the regulations around data in the last few years, and especially with regards to protection of personal information. You look at the things like the PAPAIA Act and look at the policyholder regulations as to what we have to do with data and how we look after data. It has changed the way we have to treat the responsibility of all parties within the organization, from the workers at the desk right through to the people who operate in the data centers, right through to the executive. That you know, we have to be aware of what data we keep in and what data we're allowed to keep with policyholders, what we're allowed to do with it, and essentially, you know, how long do we keep it for? When do we inform the policyholder that something's happened to their data or we want to do something with their data? And that's changed a lot of how we used to work back in the day, you know, where we just would collect data and just sort of hoard it, possibly, I guess. And you know, we really need to start thinking about, okay, first of all, good archiving strategies, good proper data management principles around how long do we keep things for, how do we essentially end of life data when we do need to. Where do we store it? How do we look after it? How do we protect it? And a lot around security as well, obviously. So all these things are starting to meld together. Your data is no longer just data. It's about securing the data. It's about how it's used and what it's going to be used for as well. So I think that's a lot around the governance. And then just from within Hollard itself, I think there's also a big shift in awareness of data not just being an IT principle anymore, which really was a problem, you know, many years back, where it was seen as, okay, well, these reports aren't balancing, so must be something wrong in IT, right? So we're really pushing to actually move responsibility for the data into the business itself. So we've set up things like data steward forums, data governance forums within business. We specifically got the business leaders to drive that so that they become responsible for that data within the organization.
Great, thank you. I think you're saying it's not an IT problem, it is a business problem, right? And I think that not only regulated industries are going through this, all industries are. Yeah. So thank you very much. Let's stick with you for a moment, and maybe you tell me, what are your priorities on data and AI for the next year?
Right. So, I mean, one of our big priorities essentially is move to cloud, and it's a project that started about 2 years back in our division, and first with design of an end-state architecture, and then moving to, just on that point, essentially what we had seen happening in the past is that there was a lot of focus around the actual operational systems. We were spending about 80% of our IT capacity on just supporting the run-of-the-mill day-to-day operations within our line of business systems. And very little focus was given to data, was given to this kind of integration between data and external parties and even internal systems. So we kind of try to flip that on its head and start off with a data-centric architecture. So what we started with was, what do we want to see this end state to look like? And that was to really have all of our data in one place, validated, trusted, and really that would be the basis and foundation that we build the rest of the architecture on top of. And once we've got that right, and we can integrate into that data and have the correct controls around it, then everything else kind of falls into place. So we've been on that journey now for about 2 years, and we've just started a project to move into the Azure modern data platform, essentially. And it's opening up a lot of opportunities around new technologies, which things like using the ADF to move data around and so on. But then also the governance around data, being able to hook it into key security technologies to do role-based authentication against who can and can't access the data. But I think also to one of Paul's earlier points, to just have this a bit of reset to try and get everything right. And a big thing for us is this data consolidation. We've gone through so many mergers and acquisitions in the last few years. We've acquired a lot of other new data sources, and especially in our division, we play very, very much in the broker market side of things. So most of our data sits outside of our premises anyway. So we retrieve a lot of that data through acquisition from our brokers. And now having to bring that on, store it into one place, normalize it so it's all able to be reported on, getting the business to trust that data, it's also all part of this journey that we are now.
Great. Thank you very much, Adrian. Same question to you, Paul. What are your priorities for the next year?
Our biggest focus and priority is obviously cloud and Nedbank. It's an all-in game for us. We really need the advantages of what cloud brings us in terms of agility, in terms of new capability. And that's in line with our digital strategy. So our entire digital strategy at Nedbank is to accelerate digital, accelerate marketplaces, accelerate APIs. There's a lot of press around Nedbank, around its open banking APIs and the marketplace APIs at the moment. And that is our priorities: accelerate digital and data in the cloud. And it's that simple. There's no other higher level priority than that from a technology perspective. Obviously, those strategies support our core banking strategies greatly. But when it comes to data and technology, it's a very simple answer, and that is to accelerate digital and data into the cloud. There's nothing more, nothing less to that. And a lot of our engineering on our execution organisation is changing and gearing up for exactly that. We're training on a monthly, in a quarter basis, 120 odd Microsoft certified professionals in cloud, various cloud related certifications. So for everything from HR to training to our conversations we have at the lowest level to performance management, it's all driven around how quickly do we digitize our organisation and move into the cloud. And we've got some very, very aggressive targets over the next 2 to 3 years. I think our cloud targets are 80% in the cloud in the next 2 years. That's massive. That's 80% of all your systems. 80% of all your systems and data is in the cloud within the next 2 years. Very aggressive targets. And likewise, we have the same aggressive outlook on our digital platform side, where we're accelerating and opening up to various experimental and sort of cutting edge partnerships and technologies. And again, that's not something we would have normally have done necessarily, but acceleration in that dimension as well to support the 80-20 digital cloud sort of strategy. So very, very much, and it filters down to the whole organisation at the lowest level. So there's no function in Nedbank that escapes that conversation.
That's fantastic. Thank you, gentlemen, for sharing your insight. It sounds like a very, very exciting journey that both of you are on. I guess over the last few minutes, I've learned a few things. The one is about creating agility, 2 is about creating resilience, and 3 is about creating efficiency. These areas relate to the employee experience, the operations of your businesses, and to your customers. In all of these areas, you've shown me different tools, processes, and creating a learning organization as all of us are on this journey together. I think it's very similar in many, many industries. The first, I think, about reducing cost and risk is critical to all our businesses. The second is using cloud, data, and artificial intelligence to modernize our organizations. I once again want to take the time to thank you for sharing the insights from your different businesses to be with us. Thank you.